Hi, Robert. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you today, right on the heels of the fresh announcement that we could potentially have the first woman president in the United States, and not just the first woman, but the first Black woman, the first Asian American, the first Asian woman, Asian American woman. It's so many things. Our minds are just spinning, and I'm so excited. But I know some people absolutely hate it because sexism and racism is flying around everywhere. But I just wanted to kind of right out the gate know how you're reacting to this fresh news. Like, how are you processing it? What are your thoughts around some of the things we're seeing?
Well, first of all, I would be remiss if I didn't start by saying thank you for having me on your show. And I appreciate having this opportunity to talk with you and to your listeners about all the things that we're going to discuss. And I am exhausted more than more than anything else. All the memes that you see about just being worn out from living in historical times, that's where I am. It's hard to keep up with everything. Part of me is hopeful. I love the idea of Kamala as our president. But honestly, I fear that my big concern is that as a Black woman, at least mostly presenting Black woman, that she is going to potentially be leapfrogged by other people in her party. I'm concerned that there is a lot of misogyny and internalized misogyny and racism within our own party, the Democratic Party, much less on the other side of the aisle. And I think that having a Black woman as the candidate, who I think is the most qualified, and I think that she should be the candidate, I think she should be the nominee. I think that that is at least two bridges too far for most of America, particularly the right. And so that's my concern, is that there was a little bit of a baiting that happened, and that we've gone for it by dropping Joe and allowing Kamala to take the lead. So I hope that it works out. She's hands down more qualified than Donald Trump, but we'll see how America behaves.
Yeah, we all carry a bit of trauma from what happened with Donald Trump, and going against our first woman candidate of any major party, and who was also a lawyer. I'd be interested to hear your perspective as somebody who's also an attorney, because Kamala is from here in the Bay Area where I live, so she was the district attorney here in San Francisco for years, and then our attorney general here in the state of California. She's gone after men like Trump, and so what are you expecting to see even as they debate each other? Her being a lawyer and him being, a convicted felon. What are you expecting to see, at least in the debate?
Well, you couldn't ask for a better matchup in terms of the optics and the irony of it. The actual convicted felon against a prosecutor. It just doesn't get any better. And if there's anyone that Donald Trump despises more than African Americans or women, it's almost, this story has written itself in a way that screenwriters just could never. And so it's great. I think that she's going to perform phenomenally as a debater if Trump is willing to debate her, because she carries with her those trial advocacy skills that you have as a trial attorney, specifically as a prosecutor. You learn how to narrow and funnel down the issues and to make cogent points in articulate ways, to cross-examine your opposing counsel. There's the rambling and the ranting and all the things that we're used to. When we listen to Donald, he's just great. He just keeps talking. That's not gonna work against her.
Yeah, I mean, we saw her debate Pence, and for so many women everywhere, and my Black women friends in particular, the looks that she gave him. I was literally driving in my car when the debate was going on, her against Pence and the vice presidential race, and I was I got a text from a friend and she's like, "Are you watching this debate?" And I was like, "Well, I'm driving in my car." She's like, "Pull over, wherever you're doing, pull over because you have to see Kamala's face." It's like the face every woman wants to give when they get interrupted and, mansplained and all the things we just deal with all the time. And it's like, I'm talking. And then there's the famous Maya Rudolph SNL sketch where she does it so perfectly.
Yeah.
And I think that imagining that debate between her and Trump, it feels she's even more prepared because she's now had 4 years to be vice president, and she brings in her experience of having gone against guys like this. She seems to be very level-headed when he kind of flies off. And so, yeah, it'll be kind of wild.
Yeah, and not just, guys like Trump, but world leaders.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that what we need to remember, whether you're talking about a nominee that could potentially leapfrog over her, or whether you're talking about her going head to head with Trump, she has gone head to head with world leaders. She has classified information that everyone else is not privy to. Like, she has gone to the mat. So she's clearly the most qualified, in my opinion. And I actually talk in the book at one point about that moment where she's debating Pence and he's talking over her and he's interrupting her. He's going over his time. And she repeatedly says, "I'm speaking. I'm speaking." And I think that so many minorities, and I say this, minorities being, Black, brown, indigenous people of color, LGBTQIA women, understand that phenomena of being talked over and silenced in society and having to assert yourself and say, "I'm speaking." And so that really was a cultural moment for so many of us.
Oh, it was. Once you saw that she could do that, she just like went up like 10 points in so many people's minds, because that is hard to do. And I think that what we're going to see going forward is what we would see with any woman. We saw it with Hillary Clinton. I even when Hillary Clinton, I voted for her back in Singapore when I was living there, and mailed in my ballot at the embassy and posted a picture on Facebook at the time, which I spend way less time on now because it's so political. But I just posted a picture of me voting for a woman for the first time. I was excited about that, and a lot of my evangelical women friends, even ones that are in ministry that are, I thought were people who cared about dignity for women and all people, said all kinds of things that were horrible to me. And a lot of them, when I started like asked them what was going on and tried to figure out if it was any internalized misogyny, the comeback I kept getting was, "Well, we would vote for Condoleezza Rice." I'm seeing that come around again. And I still question, well, would they? Because I think any woman has a likability factor. It's that needle that's hard to thread. Too warm, too strong. You can't quite get it right as a woman. Add on the additional intersectionality of Black woman, of Indian American woman, daughter of immigrants. Her mother was Hindu. Like, you have all these things. She's married to a man who's Jewish. Like, all of it. She's just going to face all of those things. And yet I think, she's strong. And so I think it's going to get really hard for a long time, and it's going to be painful to watch. I think our role, so many of us listening, and I include anybody around the world, you don't have to be a U.S. citizen to defend women, to defend people of color, to defend people who are religious minorities or any of that, right? When you see bullying, you stand up against it. And I know that you, as a litigator, as somebody who's like been, you work as attorney, you have to go against things that are wrong. And that's sort of what led you to write this book, because you experienced a spiritual environment in the Bible Belt. And I have a quote from your book that really stuck out. It's, "Deconstruction was not part of some plan I hatched." And so deconstruction being the word that you used and many people use who have been in a religious space of some type, especially evangelical Christianity, where you're sort of dismantling parts of it for yourself, right? So deconstruction was not part of some plan I hatched. Like many, I never chose to question my faith. For me, it was the inevitable result of spiritual trauma stemming from right-wing Christianity's complicity with racism, living in the Bible Belt, that left me and my family feeling spiritually homeless. We have wandered through the wastelands of religion like nomads. Help me understand your experience and what you're bringing into this book and why you wrote it.
Yeah. So starting in 2015, I would say, was in hindsight when I began the process of deconstruction. And at that point in time, I still identified as a conservative politically. And I was attending a Christian megachurch, like 4,000 people go to this church, and my family, deeply embedded in this church. My wife and I share an interracial marriage, and our children are interracial. And we really thought up until that point in time that we were part of this community, belonged in this community. And starting with the campaigning that happened by Donald Trump in 2015, we could see a shift that was happening among our mostly white friends within evangelical church context, and particularly at the church that we were at the time. And so the more that happened, the lynching of African Americans by police officers, and minority violence, like Asian violence, that was perpetuated, that we saw across the country, and the way that the slang that was used, like the pejoratives talking about COVID as the Kung flu, those sorts of things we saw more and more growing as we got closer to the election. And I just realized, well, I'm talking now about the 2020 election, but we saw we saw the other things in the 2016 election. I just realized that the place that I was going to church and the people that I was worshiping with, we didn't share the same views about our faith. And it's one thing to compartmentalize your faith from your work or your faith from some other aspect of your life. But what do you do when you find that you're compartmentalizing your faith from the people and the place that you worship and what you essentially believe? So while I never thought that I, as a lifelong Christian, would be susceptible to questioning my faith, I had to. I had to break it down to the atoms and the molecules and decide what gets to remain. The default setting is everything goes away. So what gets to stay? And then rebuild it back up in order to determine how to move forward. And so that's what I want to help people do as I'm going through this book. And I want people to be able to gather together as a community and to say, if it looks like the Western Christian church has lost its mind, everyone that trained us, if you're a believer, everyone that you've been friends with and worked next to, all your family members, caught up in this wave of fanaticism and conspiracy theories and racism. If it seems like these people have lost their mind, it's because that's exactly what has happened. And it's not just you. You're not alone. You're not siloed by yourself, although I think that the goal is to make us think that we are. And so there is a path forward for our healing and for our sanity. And that's what I want people that are reading this to understand.
So helpful. And that experience that you're sharing, I know many are going to relate to it, because when it comes to, a fundamentalism, whether it's in Islam or in Christianity and evangelicalism, any faith tradition, it dehumanizes and it isolates and it makes you feel that it's you against the world somehow. And then extreme things happen in all kinds of scenarios. I lived in the largest Muslim nation in the world for 10 years during, I was there when 9/11 happened, when the U.S. started bombing Afghanistan. There were protests against, U.S. citizens, and all kinds of things were going on. And I lived even in a province under Sharia law, right? So, and some of my best friends are very, very devout Muslims, but there is something very different about a fundamentalist Christian or a fundamentalist Muslim. There are just differences that happen in that regard. And I think that when you talk about megachurch, I hear it quite a bit. And I had this experience myself very recently when I first came to the US right before COVID to work here. Sometimes megachurch makes it a little more splashy and glitzy with fog machines and like cooler, skinny jeans and music. And, you don't see people eating fried chicken and doing the First Baptist, church thing. It's not old hymns. It just looks cooler. But some of those situations, I wouldn't say every megachurch is like this, but too many of them that I hear of, it's like a hidden fundamentalism they weren't expecting. Was that a
Mhm.
part of your experience, and was it shocking at all if it was?
Absolutely. It's so weird to me looking back on my experience that that is the way that fundamentalism has packaged itself. And it makes sense because it's successful. It's a successful model of basically saying, hey, we're cool and come join us. We've got these lights and these lasers and these fog machines and the great music. The issue is that, like you said, it's a lure, it's a bait that's being used to bring people into the door. And what was particularly true at the church that I was at was there was a huge focus on diversity, at least storefront diversity on the outside, and on missions. And
Mm.
there was almost a predatory level recruiting college age students, sometimes out of college, to go do missions, to join the church planting school or Bible school, to go start churches. And these people have no life experience. And then they get over there and they realize that this lie that they've been sold, this idea that they're going to go convert the world, and the world is just fine being who they are, culturally in different places, things like that. Like they get disenchanted, they get burned out, they deconstruct, they lose their faith. I've seen that a lot. And I it's so funny to me that this is how fundamentalism has packaged itself, because I would think that it would be synonymous with a stuffed shirt, and like you said, the traditions are more like high church and things like that. But here there's a sense at which theologically they're very and politically they're very conservative, but there's also this expression of like praying in tongues and raising your hands in worship and running around the church. And so there's these expressions of religion that are very progressive and new. And so it's really weird how those marry, but I think that it just goes to marketing. I think that it's what the young people want, and so that's what they have to be.
Yeah, it's so fascinating that you described that, because my undergrad's in sociology, and I remember us studying kind of, culty type environments in my sociology of religion class. And, one of the things you learn when you start to study cult-like environments is that there is an age group that is typically highly recruited in any cult.
Mm,
So college campuses are hotbeds for any cult environment, because that is an age where you've left your parents' home. Human development around that age is that you're more open-minded to new ideas. And if you're in a new place where you don't have friends and you don't really belong yet, cults provide a lot of belonging and meaning, and a lot of times a burnout culture. So you really get, and I mean, I'm not at all saying this to say that every church campus recruitment organization is culty in any way, but it is interesting that those two elements are it's something to be open-minded about. It's something to be curious about and critically
mhm,
think about, because not every church is solidly following what the Bible says. In fact,
mhm,
when you look at some of, and I don't have the stomach to watch a lot of the Trump stuff, but from the moment he just, days ago was shot in the ear at a rally,
mhm,
and everything started to just domino effect. I had never watched a Republican convention. I mean, I've actually never voted for Republican in my whole life, because I've just, even though I'm a strong Christian, they haven't really, I haven't seen the values I'm looking for in that party typically. It's not that I don't agree with anything, but I just have never seen the need to vote for any candidate. I just felt like the lack of religious liberty there was troubling to me,
mhm,
as somebody who has
mhm,
friends from all religious backgrounds. And then, also just international relations is a big deal for me, having grown up abroad. But when
mhm,
I watched the Trump Republican convention, over the last few days, and then every speech being given was really praising him, not just saying I endorse him, but really like a worship. It felt like a worship service
mhm,
when I'm looking at it through a sociological lens. And so that's the stuff that gets a little troubling. You talk a bit about this Christian nationalism, and how would you define or describe Christian nationalism? And what are your concerns as you're starting to see the religion and politics get blended here in our country?
Yeah, so I actually went a step further than just defining Christian nationalism, because I think that that's fairly summed up as the marriage of our patriotic values with the idea of the selfish idea that our nation and our goals have to take priority over all other cultures, married with our faith, Christian nationalism. And so what that ends up doing is it subverts Jesus into a symbol for a political cause. What I actually wanted to do in my book was talk about white Christianity, and that's how I phrase it. Because if I tell you, looking at the Pew Research data from the 2016 election, that 81% of the people that voted for Trump identified themselves as white evangelicals. Here in the United States, that probably doesn't surprise you. But the word evangelical for us in the United States, that has taken on a political tone, whereas Africa, Latin America, they don't have that same baggage that we do here,
Right.
particularly in the Bible Belt, when you talk about evangelicalism and equating it to politics. So I really had to struggle with what is the animal that we are wrestling against when we're talking about this Donald Trump cult-like phenomenon that has swept not just the political party, but also influenced the church. And, the fact of the matter is that, phrases like, heteronormative, Christian, nationalistic, misogynoir, misogyny, patriarchy, LGBTQIA, bigotry, context of church environment, none of that rolls off the tongue.
Yeah.
Like it's a lot.
It's a
And
lot.
so
Yeah.
what I had to do is I say, okay, it's not evangelicalism. That's not the issue. That on one side, that's a little bit too narrow, because we are seeing these issues within the Baptist church, and you see it among Catholics and things like that. But then also among those that don't share any faith, those who identify themselves as agnostic or atheist, who are also swept up in it. So it's not about just a denomination. And it goes beyond fundamentalism, like we talked about. And so I really had to be honest with myself and wrestle with, I think that what we're really dealing with here is whiteness, and it's white supremacy within a Christian context. And so I call it white Christianity. And so I define white Christianity very clearly by what number one is not. I'm not talking about just white people who are white, who are Christians.
Right.
That's not what it is. It's really a worldview that encourages cultural homogeneity or homogeny through assimilation, or even the promotion of nationalism.
Yeah.
And it gives equal emphasis to a unified stance against things, cultural phenomenon like diversity, inclusion, and equity, DEI. You hear that, or wokeness. It emphasizes what it's against, and it views those things as threatening to that homogeny. And so it's completely possible for a congregation that appears to be ethnically diverse, even led by an African American pastor, to perpetuate the ills of white evangelicalism, quote unquote, as they encourage other minorities to conform with the majority culture. So an example of that, Condoleezza Rice, that you talked about earlier, I don't know much about her faith, but the point being that she's less threatening to a white supremacist mindset, because she is, quote, one of us to them. And so when you examine it in that context, so white Christianity also becomes this subset of Christianity that intentionally ignores or doesn't consciously consider the effects of racism or prejudice in either church or society on the marginalized, and nor does it care to, having been given ample resources and information to do so.
That phrase, she's one of us. I'm really curious to hear you unpack that a little bit more, because I know that sometimes, for example, when I watched the Republican National Convention this week, which was really hard to stomach, but it was before we had the news that Biden was stepping down, and everything looked like, well, this man's going to be our president, so I want to know what we're getting in for, right? And I kind of wanted to hear what everybody was saying to kind of figure out how to brace ourselves. But I mean, this news of Kamala has kind of turned things around. There's a little bit of hope now. Actually, a lot in
Lord
my
have
perspective.
mercy.
I know. But when you say, I know, right? When you say she's one of us, help us unpack that. Because when I hear you say that, here's what I'm hearing. I see a white crowd largely at the Republican National Convention. You see cowboy hats. You see, the white music. Everything is very white. Mm-hmm. And then occasionally you have splashes of diversity. You have like a Latina family whose son was killed in a war, and they get up and speak. And then you have, is it Ben Carson, who was in the cabinet? He had very few people that he had worked with. Like, so many Republicans weren't there. Mike Pence wasn't there. All these people weren't there, right? But there are some people that are kind of splashes of what is different. And so you kind of think, well, what's their deal? So what would it mean to be one of them? How would you be accepted? And what does that look like? And what are you losing by being one of them, I guess, is the question.
Yeah. So I think that, to draw an analogy, if I were to tell you or to ask you, is it possible for a woman to be somehow entangled with or complicit with proximity to patriarchy? In other words, is it possible for a woman to perpetuate patriarchy? I think that you would agree with me that there are some women that carry internalized misogyny at such a level that they want to be close to power, and so they're willing to make sort of a devil's bargain with misogyny in order to be closer to those in power. I think that you would recognize that concept. A lot of your listeners would recognize that. There's a similar dynamic that happens with minorities, in that we can make a devil's bargain. We can try to be one of the good ones. And I was guilty of this in my past. In order to have proximity to power, we deal with the stereotypes, the microaggressions. We deal with all the different ways that white supremacy puts its tentacles on us in order to ultimately be closer to the difference makers. As long as I'm on the inside, if I'm on the inside of the house, then I can do more good long term. And Black people, we have blunt language for this in the United States. We call the people that have made that devil's bargain house Negroes, and then we call the people that are out here in the against the elements, fighting against all these forces directly, the field Negroes. And the house Negroes are completely fine working inside and seeing their brothers and sisters suffering on the outside because they receive the benefit of being closer to the master, so to speak. So I think it's important to acknowledge that Blackness doesn't require that you have a certain Democratic or Republican or independent loyalty to any party. I think that it's fair to say that there's expressions of Blackness that can be conservative, that can be more progressive or independent minded. The issue is with how you utilize power and how you are willing to sacrifice yourself and how you're willing to bargain at the expense of your brothers and sisters in exchange for your connection to that power. So one of the examples that I think about often is, I don't know if you remember, there's two ladies that used to have a show. Their name was Diamond and Silk. And one of them passed away recently. And I say recently, I'm probably within the last 2 years. And there was hardly anyone. These are two Black ladies. There was hardly anyone in their party that acknowledged their death. Another example was Herman Cain. He got COVID by going, I think it was during 2020, to a rally. And if I remember correctly, it was actually the rally in Tulsa that was supposed to have happened on the anniversary of the Tulsa massacre, if I recall correctly. Either that or Juneteenth. It was one of the two. And so he's, there with his friends, and he's taking pictures, and he's just proudly posting that he's there without a mask on. He ends up getting COVID, and then he dies within like 2 weeks. And I took note on my social media at the time of who among my 4,000 plus social media Facebook followers at that point, who among them had anything to say about Herman Cain's death. And the number was 14.
Oh.
Of all those people, and I'm in a largely conservative environment. Most of the people that I are connected to on Facebook, which, by the way, I don't recommend ever going back to Facebook.
Yeah, same.
But most of these people I know in real life, and this is from a very conservative community, and all these people that had great things to say about Herman Cain when he was close to power and he was towing the party line, only 14 had something to say about his death. And so I think about that from time to time, because the fact of the matter is that when you allow yourself to be tokenized, you ultimately do yourself a disservice, because when you are at your deathbed, they will not think twice about you, and tokens get spent. And so, so that's my rant about power and about being one of trying to be close to the inside, is just that ultimately it's a disservice to ourselves as much as to the community.
So good to help us unpack it, because the thing about tokens is they're used to keep people in a system and a narrative. Like, see, we're diverse. Like,
Mm-hmm.
we have whoever, and they name it. I've been a token before, and I didn't realize I was one, and so that's why I can see it. And by staying when you're a token, somehow you realize at some point you're complicit when you wake up to it, and that's a really hard reality.
Yeah.
And then I think that what we're seeing thrown around even now is, as soon as this announcement came out about Kamala, is we're starting to, immediately see the misogynoir, the misogyny, the racism, all these things are coming out very, very overtly, as they do now in our society with social media. And I think one of the things we started to see thrown out there is, oh, she's just a diversity hire. To me, that feels like projection, because like maybe that's all you would ever do. But that's not what we do over here. That's not how we are. We don't do that kind of thing. And in fact, that's not true, because her qualifications are outrageously amazing. She's been a senator. She went after Brett Kavanaugh. Like, that's some of the best video you'll see. I just recently read Christine Blasey Ford's book. I'm friends with her neighbor here who's a victim of Harvey Weinstein. Christine Blasey Ford's book is incredible. She walks through what it was like to be a survivor, a whistleblower, and working through our justice system and how awful it was. And it wasn't even a proper trial. But in that story, you have Kamala Harris even coming out and her questioning as a prosecutor of Brett Kavanaugh. That video is really worth everybody revisiting. We'll try to remember to link it in the show notes. But she's qualified. And yet somehow there's certain people that can only see her as a token, and maybe it's projection because that's all they would have ever seen too. It's dehumanizing. It doesn't allow people, women or people of color, to have dignity. And I think that when we look at the foundations of our nation, and I had my friend Lisa Sharon Harper on the podcast recently, who does a great deal of work with this and Freedom Road and all that. But when we look at the foundations of the United States, and for people around the world, if you haven't heard that podcast, go back and listen to it, because it'll help you understand this conversation. So much of our Constitution dehumanized people who weren't white men, essentially. We have the Three-Fifths Compromise, which, like, what in the world is that? And women weren't even a thought, and so when we look at this more perfect union we're trying to go towards, some people are having trouble because white supremacy is the foundation, unfortunately, and it's tied with Christianity. To me, a poor interpretation of those scriptures, but it's still there. So how are you seeing some of those foundational aspects? Because I know as a lawyer, the Constitution is something that you had to really study and be in your everyday life and in your role, consider how do you hold that the Constitution that's had to have all these amendments and what we're using in courts, knowing it is also it's still a work in progress. What is your perspective on all that?
Yeah, first of all, I would just again be remiss if I didn't say that that was a fantastic episode. I did get to listen to it,
Oh,
and
glad you heard
yeah,
it.
I was really just blown away. It just amazes me as an attorney how many times our jurisprudence comes down to Black people want to do something that white people can do. White people don't want that to happen. And so there's a huge legal fight that ensues. The Supreme Court weighs in and says, yep, Black people can do that. And then there's a consummate struggle for, years, decades afterwards about, well, did they really mean that, And so I think it's in chapter 4, I just go through this litany when we're talking about this myth that all lives matter, and going all the way back to the Declaration of Independence. And, we hold these truths to be separate. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. They didn't really mean that, obviously, because we were property at that point in time. But going forward, when we say, okay, so we want to go to school. No. You can't go to school with us. And so we've got to fight a battle about that. Well, okay, well, we want to go to, that's the high school. Now we want to go to college. No. No. The Supreme Plessy, they referred to him as an octoroon at that point in time. He was 1/8 Black. So that's the, yeah. So that's,
you have a word for that?
They had a word for that. They're exactly right. They had a word for someone that you had, that little bit of Blackness in you. We want to make sure that you know your place, and so you're an octoroon. That one kills me. But so the Supreme Court has to weigh in and says, no, you got to make this travel available to everyone. Well, what about if it's just a train or a bus that's traveling within the state, not interstate commerce? We're going to fight about that. Loving, versus Virginia, we're going to fight about whether or not minorities can do interracial marriage. It's one thing after another, all the way up to most recently voting rights. And it will never cease to amaze me. And that is so much of what our jurisprudence is built upon the backs of these stories, one after another, just a parade of history of minorities being mistreated and trying to receive equality, and society pushing back against that. And you can call that whatever you want to, but at the end of the day, it's racism. And like you said, it's dehumanizing to realize that there's no context in which we're allowed to be ourselves, to be free, and to be recognized for our inherent human value. Kamala, for example, is a highly qualified candidate for president of the United States, like you've mentioned. But she hasn't done enough. She hasn't earned her stripes. She hasn't, she was a diversity hire. She was the insults will never stop. And it's designed, it's not because I don't think that her detractors really believe that she's not qualified. I think that, these are ultimately just ways of saying the quiet part out loud. And, Lee Atwater famously, when he was talking about the new Southern strategy and working with Reaganism, and, he started off, he said, you start off saying inward, but then as time passes, you can't say that anymore. So then you start using language like busing, welfare queen, thugs. Like those are code words that are used to dehumanize us and to communicate the same thing. And so it's super frustrating because, the people that are making these critiques of Kamala are children of privilege. We don't talk enough about how there are legacies that get to go to your Yales, your Stanfords, your Harvards, they, once grandpa got you in, then, in perpetuity, that family line gets
Yeah.
to have that prestige of that higher level of education. And so, yeah, it's frustrating because there's, I know this is true for me as a lawyer too. I've dealt with my share of racism in the courtroom, and it doesn't matter that I have a JD degree at the back of my name. It doesn't matter that I'm about to be an accomplished author. It doesn't matter how many trials I won. It doesn't matter how big a case I've taken. It just, all those things don't matter. There's someone that's going to look at me and says, that guy doesn't belong here.
Yeah. And that's a horrible reality. All these years into the history of the United States, the year of our Lord, 2024,
Mm-hmm.
that is still something that is an everyday experience for Black men, Black women, boys and girls all over this nation, Kamala Harris included, right? And so as we go into this next, what is going to be a really painful, either way, whatever the outcome is, it's going to be a painful
Yeah.
gauntlet that we're going to have to plow through. And it's going to be, people who are exhausted and need to take breaks. My hope is, we see in the polls here in the United States, Black women have carried, Democratic Party through many things. 90 to 96% of Black women tend to vote for the Democratic presidential candidate. And yet, a lot of things I'm seeing are people are saying Black women need to step up and vote. And I'm thinking, well, no, they do. We don't, we need to mobilize the white women, the white evangelical women. We need the Asian Americans. We need the Latinos to also, step up and carry this. Cause I think that especially with Black women, we expect them to do a lot of labor and not pay them, not recognize them.
Mm-hmm.
And Black men as well, because of the history of free labor and what this, what we talked about with Lisa Sharon Harper on that podcast episode is that doing work but not getting recognized, and then being treated as less than human still in our everyday society. So when you think about those obstacles, and you are a lawyer and you do work that out in the courtroom, and you do have a version of your faith that's different than what you had, how do you integrate your faith in your law practice as it is now?
That's a great question. I actually teach a class on this, and I was fortunate enough this summer, Baylor Law School accepted a proposal for a new class, and it's called Integrating Faith and Legal Practice. And so as an adjunct professor, I actually just got done teaching that class this last 10 weeks. And it was an amazing opportunity to connect with 17 future lawyers about the difficulties of our practice. And one of the source book for our class is a book that was written by a lawyer named Joseph Allegretti. And Allegretti was a lawyer that got burned out and decided, I'm going to go to seminary and become a pastor because I just feel like a hired gun and I don't know how to do this job and keep my faith intact. And he gets to seminary, and what does he find but a bunch of other burned out former attorneys who had the same idea. And so he's like, there's got to be a way for us to reconcile our calling as believers with our mission as attorneys, and for those two things to be in harmony. And so he spends the rest of the book talking about that. So that's what I do over the course of 10 weeks. And what it comes down to, I think, is that we have to know the why of what we're doing. So, if I'm an attorney and I'm a Christian and people know that about me, but I suck at the work that I do, that doesn't benefit anyone. And so I have to have a specific mission that is going to benefit not just me and my practice, but also the community. And I talk with students about the difficulty of dealing with really hard things that law school doesn't prepare you for. For example, when you're representing someone that you believe is 100% innocent and the jury finds them guilty, there's nothing that teaches us how to deal with that. Or the inverse, if you're a prosecutor and let's say that your boss, who is an elected official, says that you need to prosecute a case and you feel strongly that it shouldn't be prosecuted, or that the right thing to do would be probation when everyone around you is insisting that penitentiary time is the right outcome. Like there's all kinds of examples I could give, and so I want students, I want people, regardless actually of their calling, I want them to be able to harmonize those two things. And so one of the things that we talk about is, in our mission, we want our clients to feel seen, to feel heard, to feel acknowledged. We want to be known for doing good, not doing well, but doing good things in our community. We want to raise the watermark of justice. That means for me, I can go to bed feeling rested and put my head on the pillow and not overthink things if I know that by walking into the courtroom, that I have made my presence has made the process more fair, because I'm going to hold everyone to task and hold the system to account in representing my client the best that I can. And whether it's because of conviction or whether it's because of fear or respect, everyone in the room takes notice that we're involved, because they know that we're going to do our part to make the system more fair. So I have to know that, there's a lot of different ways and a lot of different reasons that we can represent people. But at the end of the day, I want the people that we represent to feel seen. I want them to feel heard. I want them to be, to realize that I see in them the imprint of a creator, and that they are valued. And if I can do those things, then I can go to bed completely at peace.
I love that. I love hearing you explain that. We need more people of strong faith to do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with God. It's something that would really turn our communities and our world around. And I hope that those students that you are able to impart that to really carry that baton forward. I'm really excited about your book coming out, Fire in the Hole. I'd love for you to let our listeners know where they can find you and your book and more of your writing. And then after that, we're going to ask you to hang out a little bit longer for our Patreon Difference Maker community, where I'm going to ask you a little bit more about your perspective as an attorney and some of the abuse cases we're seeing in certain churches, spiritual abuse included, and workplace abuse and all that. So we'll do that in our Difference Maker community. But let people know where they can find you and your book.
Yeah. So the first place and most important place that you can find me is on Amazon, where you can pre-order a copy of Fire in the Hole. And remember that whole is spelled WHOLE, as in the whole person. And so you can pre-order. The book is set to release on September the 24th, anywhere that you get books. But go ahead and pre-order now, because that really, 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 really helps so much. I'm on Twitter, or what was formerly known as Twitter, the hellscape known as X now, as R. Callahan Waco. And you can find me on Instagram Threads as R. Callahan _Waco. And if you like TikTok, you can find me at R. Callahan Waco 2.
Awesome. Thank you for being with us today, Robert. It's been a real pleasure to hear your perspective. I'm excited about your book. And everybody go pre-order Fire in the Hole. It's going to be great. And I want to hear your thoughts on it. Thanks for being with us today, Robert.
Thank you.